Welcome to the Writer Dojo with your hosts, Steve Diamond.
That's me.
And Larry Correia.
What's up, guys?
Today's episode, Pacing.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Writer Dojo. Glad to be back with you today. Now, it's pretty cool. Larry and I have, in just about a month from when this recording is going to go live, our first book that we've written together is coming out, Servants of War.
Yep. Beginning of May.
March.
I keep doing that.
It's okay.
I keep doing that.
So March 1st. So that's just around the corner.
Yeah. This is pretty exciting.
Yeah, we just had we had a conversation with Dave Butler the other night.
Oh, yeah, we did. And that'll be going live about the same time as this, or we did an interview for the Bay-In podcast hour.
Yeah. So it's all really exciting. But here's what we want to do, guys. We have a whole bunch of topics picked for you, basically for the month of February. And what we want to do is, since we're kind of leading up to this book that we're both super stoked about, what we want to do is talk about, the various topics and the nuts and bolts of them and whatnot, but also not just kind of in generalities about these things, but specifically what we did for these things in our actual book that we just finished that's about to be published.
Yeah, because a lot of the topics we talk about, we kind of go in broad strokes because there's every book is different, and there's going to be a lot of things that are non-specific. In this case, we'll talk about specifically what we did for this one particular project, and how we kind of worked through the various problems and made everything click. Like, I believe today's topic is pacing.
Today is pacing, Larry.
Yeah, this is one that actually has been asked about before, and this is a huge topic for writing. And I've written some things about pacing, and pacing is kind of one of those things that it's like it's a magic trick, My goal when I write a book is, I have 150,000 word book. The best thing I could possibly hear from reviewers is I read this in one night.
Yeah.
Because that means I hooked them and I dragged them along. Now, the key to hooking people and dragging them along, keeping reading, is pacing. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about our methods, our methodologies, how I think of it and how Steve thinks of it, and just the kind of the stuff we like to do, and some of the stuff we did here.
Yeah, I think that this goes really well with one of our last episodes that was writing for audio. We talked a lot about, various different things that we do in audio to kind of help streamline that process.
Yeah, we mentioned pacing a little bit. We actually said, and that's why we're doing this episode now, because we mentioned during the writing for audio that we needed a whole episode for this.
It's interesting, the whole idea of in different techniques that various authors apply towards pacing. I'm with you. One of the biggest compliments I ever received for my first novel was they described it. It was like a greased slide. They just started, and before they knew it, they were at the end, and it was done. And they were like, "Holy cow!"
Yeah,
like that just went through. And to be clear, I personally don't employ some of the tricks that I know some other authors do, like James Patterson, right? Like James Patterson,
he's got some kind of cheap tricks.
Yeah.
So I guess we could talk about the cheap tricks of pacing.
Sure, yeah.
That's the where your book has like 275 chapters,
and it's only 205 pages.
Yeah, because there's like a chapter is literally one paragraph.
Yeah,
or there's 3 paragraphs on a page, and that's chapter 5. And the next chapter is somebody else's perspective, and there's 4 paragraphs, and the next chapter is 2 paragraphs. That does a couple things. That artificially inflates the page count of your book, because you got a lot of white space and blank space there in the typesetting. And also, it's kind of an artificial cheap trick to drag people along. I don't like to do that. I prefer shorter chapters, but for me, when I break up my chapters, actually, I kind of do it. I do an analysis in my book. So when I write the book, I don't put chapters in. I don't break the scenes into. And actually, that's something like when you did the original rough draft of this Servants of War, Steve was doing stuff in chapters. And I pointed out I never do that for one major reason, pacing. Because at the end, I'm going to go through and read the manuscript. I'm going to find that sometimes some scenes they need to be moved somewhere else
Yeah.
to break up the pace, to either move some portions up in intensity or move some down in intensity. And so I don't actually do chapters. I'll do scene breaks. I just do usually 2 hashtags is what I search for to find scene to scene to scene. Or and my other editing trick is XXX is for anything I need to go back and find later to check. So when I'm talking about moving stuff up and down in intensity, don't think of your book as it needs to be all intense, because the mistake a lot of writers make there is they think, I'm going to make the book intense nonstop. The problem with that, though, is if intense is your normal setting, it's going to become where intense is now regular.
Yeah.
And it's hard to turn the knob all the way up and leave it all the way up the whole time, because your reader's going to get bored. The example I use is, if you've ever gone to a movie, like a blockbuster movie, like say a Michael Bay movie, and it's explosion, 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 people slow-mo running from an explosion, then some more explosions, then another explosion. Have you gotten to the end of a Michael Bay movie and you're bored of explosions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's exactly the same way for writing books. And so I like to think of it as kind of a wave. It comes up, it comes down, comes up, comes down. And I'm going to build that wave to the finale of the book. So it's going to be kind of an upward trending wave, but there's going to be moments of calm. There's going to be where stuff slows down. There's going to be parts where it picks up. And that way I'm dragging the reader along through these waves.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I mean, the hard part that I find is when I'm a reader, right? Like that's what I want.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want it to be, you know, all pedal to the metal the whole time, because like you said, that gets it can become boring. It can be exhausting. It depends on what's going on, right? The trouble is when you're writing those lower, slower parts.
Yeah.
It takes longer. I mean, shoot, I think I shared this experience from my first novel. I wrote the last half of it over the course of a week. And
it's the beauty of deadlines.
You're right. I wrote it over the course of a week. And there was one day in particular that I was having trouble. I think I had, and we've gone on and on and on about how I'm a binge writer. And there was one day in particular, I think I'd only written a few hundred words, and I was beating myself up about it because it was like this lull period in the story.
Yeah.
It was all the setup, and I was getting things ready for this big super scene at the end. And that stuff oftentimes isn't that fun to write. But then I got to the cool action scene, and I wrote, 5,000 words over the next 2 hours or whatever, something stupid like that. And that's not that different than what happened in Servants of War. I think I wrote the last 40 or 50,000 words of that over the course of like 7 or 8 days.
Yeah, because I remember you had a period there where you were kind of like working your way through the middle where you were kind of struggling,
Mm-hmm.
and then you jumped into the third act. And once you hit the third act of the book, it was like a sprint to the finish for you.
The third act for this book, for those, for those of you who don't know, I mean, in general, we tend to write things in 3-act structure. And that third act is the payoff for the whole book. Yeah,
when we hear acts are not mandatory, but it is something you'll hear writers refer to a lot, because most successful stories do kind of break into a 3-act structure, just like
Mm-hmm.
a play. Usually first act is kind of like your setup. Your second act is kind of like the process, the journey, and the third act is usually the payoff,
right,
of where this stuff all inevitably collides.
Yeah, and because you earlier you were describing that kind of that sine wave as it was kind of going up and up and up. The overall trend of it was upwards, even though there were ups and downs in it. And for us, really, in Servants of War, the third act is a massive payoff.
Yeah,
and it is pretty heavy. That whole ride. There are downs.
Well,
there are rest moments in that third
Yeah,
act.
because once again, if you do nothing but action, it causes that to become normal. So we put in basically breaks.
Mhm.
And when I say breaks, that doesn't mean that like the plot ceases moving forward, the plot is always moving forward.
Yeah.
So when I say downtime, I mean it's just levels of intensity. Because, and here's a kicker too, it doesn't necessarily need to be, when I say action, doesn't need to be the intense part. You can have intense emotional stuff. You can have just conversations between people can be chilling. In fact, I think even though it's one of the slowdowns in intensity, we're talking about this third act where we had some big major parts where characters are just talking as they're talking through basically like they're figuring out the world with their functioning in. And, there's acts of betrayal and backstabbing and trickery. But these things are not, necessarily big explosion, big explosion, big explosion. So we're mixing that up. So the intensity is actually still fairly intense, but we've also changed kind of the focus of it. So now it's more of an interpersonal intensity as opposed to a physical intensity.
Yeah, and that part is all for me. When I was writing the first draft of it, it was that all came pretty easy, just because I think overall, compared to the first two acts, it was much more intense.
Yeah.
On the
Well,
whole,
because once again, when you go back to your 3-act structure, the first act is really where you're going to spend all your time explaining how the universe works to the reader. So if you're writing we'll have an episode coming up about fantasy, but if you're writing a fantasy where the rules are not the same as our current world, it's really in that first act and second act that you establish the rules of that universe. And that takes up space and that takes up time. And if you're not good at it, that actually slows it down a lot.
Yeah.
So you need to space that stuff out too. Just like we talk about spacing out the action intensity, spacing out your world building in a way that it's organic and not just crammed in clumps.
Yeah, and when it comes to pacing, in terms of let's talk about the way in which we impart knowledge into people. There's the old adage when it comes to writing that it's, what do they say? Something like it's 90% the same and 10% different. You hear all sorts of ratios. Anyway, I'm not sure how much validity I put in them, but there is something to be said that there is a sense of familiarity that when you put things into a book that draws people in. It gives them a little bit of an anchor to hold on to. And while they're holding on to that anchor, you start peppering them with the things that are new, the things that are different. And they're like, oh, okay, I get it. But you can't do that all at once. No,
that's huge. An example is let's say you have a large cast of characters. It's very difficult. I mean, I've seen some writers pull this off where they introduce 10 characters in one scene, but that takes a very deft hand, because what's going to happen is that's going to turn into mush in the minds of the reader. You just got 10 names pounded on you, and 10, this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so. They're not going to remember that.
No,
they're not going to have
you're going to have to
context.
reintroduce them all again later.
Yeah.
So then what was the point of that first scene?
Yeah, so that's another example of pacing is you don't cram too much of the same thing in a row. That's the biggest reason I leave chapter headings off until the very final edit.
I see.
Because what'll happen is when I won't realize this when I'm writing the book, because I'm too close to the book. I'm too close to the manuscript, because in my head it all makes sense. But then as I'm writing the book, as I'm editing the book at the very end, I'll say oh, wait a second. I have 3 chapters in a row that just introduce concepts and people and introducing lots and lots of. I need to give the reader a chance to breathe and process that information. So what I'll do then is I'll take another scene that actually takes those characters and develops them a little bit more that maybe I have later in the book. I will then move that up sooner and closer. That way I've introduced these people. Now let's get to know them a little bit. So slow down. Let's get to know these people. Now I'll jump to introducing a new group of people. So that way it's not just boom, 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 new concept, new concept, new concept. It's, you're mixing that stuff up.
That's interesting. In the initial draft of Servants of War, the very first chapter was Christoph.
Yep.
And initially, and it was the scene where, he's discovering effectively kind of the book's MacGuffin, so to speak. However, in the current draft, or in the final version, that got moved. I think you swapped those first 2 chapters, right?
And that was actually kind of a pacing decision.
Well, and the interesting part about it is by by changing it so that the introduction was Ilarion Glaskov, his character. Now, for those of you out there, this character, he's basically a farm boy. And what Larry and I did in this first scene, in this first chapter, was kind of subvert the expectations of the farm boy who may or may not be the chosen one. And so what we did is by swapping those two chapters, you give the reader something familiar up front, something to grab hold of a little easier.
Yeah, that was kind of the thought there is, as on the pacing thing, is like, so you got to think about on pacing too, is like the beginning of your wave there, what your starting point is. And so because that second chapter, the one that wound up being the second chapter, it was actually a more intense chapter. Oh, yeah. Well, intense in a different direction. Because the first chapter, either way, horrible bad things happen, and like I'm saying, horrible bad things happen to good people in both of these chapters. But one of them makes a different kind of promise to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example of that. There's an author by the name of John D. Brown, and I've written a book with John, and great guy. Steve, you read some of his stuff. Great guy. Many years ago, John's first fantasy novel, he did it through Tor, and his editor. So John wrote this book, and it's actually a fairly dark novel. Servants of a Dark God it's called Servants of a Dark God is the name of the book, right? And so there's the original Tor version. But when you read the book, like the actual physical book,
the intro is really weird.
So what happened is originally John had where the book opened super, super dark with this scene of just basically kind of a massacre and horrible things happening. And then he had it really, really dark for the first couple chapters. And then there was a scene where we got to meet kind of the hero, who's going to be the hero character. And it just kind of is like this lighthearted scene because John had paced it well. So they had super intense, and now let's back off and get to know this guy from character development. And it's just him interacting with his family, and it's kind of fluffy and fun. It starts out with this guy like trying to find his pants. His pants have been stolen, right?
That's right.
So what happened was his editor, though, took that fluffy scene and put it as chapter 1. So for the readers pick up this book and they read the first scene. And the first scene says, this is a fluffy, fun, happy adventure story.
3 minutes later.
3 minutes later, horrific massacre. And then the whole rest of the book is, dark.
Yeah.
So what happens there is it's all about the promise that you make to your reader at the very beginning. So if you don't ever want to make the reader feel like you did a bait and switch, So in this case, either way was super dark either way. So it wasn't really so much that. It was more just, my feeling was by opening with the main hero character versus the main dark character, because Kristoff's kind of an antagonist dirtbag character.
Yeah.
By opening it, it gave a different promise as far as the overall arc of the book. Even though Kristoff is like a major third of the book, he's not the primary. He's not the hero.
Right. Well, and to your point, by switching it up, we have the main character, the main protagonist of the book is Ilarion, good farm kid. Bad stuff happens to him. He's still a good dude. Then one of the other main characters, main point of view characters, is a guy named Kristoff, who's a secret policeman, terrible, horrible human being.
Awful, terrible person.
Now, bad things happen in both those chapters. However, if we would have led with the Kristoff chapter first, I think it would have put people in the grimdark mindset right from the start. And in reality, that isn't really how the book reads.
No, and also it was more espionage spy stuff and intrigue versus action
versus fantasy monsters.
Craziness. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of about setting expectations. Yep. So that's the beginning of your pacing.
Yep. All right. We are we're kind of at the midpoint of this episode, so we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, and we're going to continue talking about some of these pacing things.
Julie LaPlante's life of day job drudgery is shattered when she's abducted by a menacing stranger. Waking in a cheap motel room, Julie makes a terrifying discovery. There's a bomb strapped to her chest, and the timer is counting down. Julie has 24 hours to travel 1,000 miles, where a hidden code that disarms the device waits. No car, no money, no phone, no way to contact anyone for help. Julie's been left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single deadly object, a loaded gun. As the countdown ticks towards certain death, Julie sets out on a journey that will not only test her to the core, but plunge her into a dark conspiracy that could forever alter the fabric of society itself. Waypoint, a novel by Matthew Howe. It's available on Amazon.com. Pick up your copy today.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So, right before the break, we were kind of talking about how oddly enough, pacing is influenced by things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. You know, when most people think of pacing, they think, well, how fast are you running? Or, you know, what's the, you know, what are the beats per measure of a song or something like that. However, when it comes to books, a lot of it has to do with expectations. It has to do with the way you're setting scenes up, the importance of them. And we were talking about John Brown's thing. Now over the break, you and I were talking about how you wanted to mention really quick.
Oh, yeah. So if you purchase the John's books now, he got the rights back from this publishing house, and he actually redid this himself in his original vision.
Yeah.
So if you compare the two, it's actually really kind of interesting, because I think John's original idea, even though this is his first novel, I think his original idea of how to pace it was much better.
It's interesting. When I this is from my days as a reviewer, which is how I got to know John. And I remember reading that book and doing the review of it. And I described it as an epic fantasy without an epic quest. And because a lot of it is very centralized in a small location, actually, the first book. And I remember a friend of mine saying, well, then it's not epic fantasy because, you know, it has to have this great epic quest and everything. I said, you're missing the point. This is all about pacing. It's the way in which the story unfolds, the way in which he gives you information, the way in which action happens and relationships are formed. That is a pacing element in active decisions that you're making when you're writing fantasy novels.
Well, why do so many fantasy novels have the quest?
So they do something.
Exactly. It's a pacing thing. So usually if you look at the fantasy novel that has the structure where there's the inciting incident, then you form a team, you go on a quest, and you reach your resolution. I mean, it goes back to Tolkien was the godfather of the genre, and so that's what he did, and everybody kind of followed, which is interesting because if you actually read the book, it's actually 6 novels, you know, right, put together. It's different, okay, because you have whole big chunks all about one thing. So it's actually not paced like a modern thing. But everybody, all these fantasy authors have since run with that. And so you think about it, the quest is basically a matter of pacing because it forces the story to move from place to place. And every time you move from place to place, what happens? You have to introduce the new place. It actually breaks off. And it's like, okay, so now we are in Gnome Land, and let's describe Gnome Land and get to know some gnomes. Oh no, there's another adventure thing, and now we have to move to Dwarf Land, and you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so it kind of drags you through that pacing process. It's kind of like there's these certain formulas you see over and over and over again in different genres. I mean, if you're talking about like the Hallmark movies, you know, that brand of romance, they have that too, where not my expertise, but I have one daughter.
Larry, whatever.
I have one daughter who's watched like 6,000 of them, and they all kind of follow the same basic patterns, the same basic beats. Cop shows. I mean, me and you both love cop shows.
Yeah. Cop shows I mean, you and I have watched enough cop shows that when we start watching a new one, we know what's going to happen.
Yeah, because a lot of times, once again, they tend to follow these same basic beats. You got your inciting criminal incident, then you have like the investigation that'll move from person to person that they talk to as they find more clues.
One's the red herring.
Yeah, there's usually the red herring. It leads them off in a different direction. There will be some action sequences in there that once again break up the pace. And it's funny too, because you can see this in books. You can see this in movies that are, you know, a smaller format. You can see this in episodic television. Mm-hmm. And you can see in some shows where it's one episode is about one story, and you can see it about others where have a continuing story over an entire season.
Well, this is like Justified, right? Remember the first season of Justified? It's arguably the hardest season for people to get into.
Yeah.
Because the first episode fantastic.
Boyd Crowder is
Boyd
the
Crowder,
bad guy.
Fire in the Hole, basically,
Yep.
and it's based on the short story, the eponymous short story. So, but then the next like 5 episodes are very story of the week.
Yeah, they're very
And-
crime of the
Mhm.
week.
and have almost no relation to what we thought we were going to get in the first story or in the first episode. And then the series kind of moves on a little bit. And by the time you get to the end of the first season, it's like the writers realized, oh, you know what? We'd be better off if we just told a consolidated story
Yep.
and then pepper it in here and there little cases of the week.
Exactly.
They flipped the pacing of that.
So they brought in Boyd Crowder once again. They brought Boyd back and to be the reoccurring villain.
Mhm.
And now you had 2 simultaneous storylines. You had the Boyd storyline and you had the Raylan storyline as they went back and forth. And then if you look at the subsequent seasons of Justified, they all follow that Boyd and Raylan interdynamic. And you wind up with one of the greatest stories ever on television.
It's fantastic. Can't wait for the sequel.
Oh man,
baby.
I'm so worried because I mean everything Hollywood lets me down so much now that I'm like, oh please don't screw this
What
up.
do you mean? The Matrix was super good.
Oh, I know. I mean, don't ruin Justified for me. But Justified was supremely well paced for a TV show. And you think about it once again, what would you have? You'd have like these light moments where like Raylan is like, you know, associating with other people. You have these funny scenes where he's like fighting with various goofy rednecks. Then he had intense scenes where it was like, you know, life or death shootouts. You had the cool scenes, the funny scenes. And it had a great supporting cast where we would jump to these other characters, you know, Art and Tim and Rachel and like all these great supporting characters, right? And so that was just a supremely well-paced show for the most part.
Well, and I think back to one of your earlier points, and I hope that all the listeners are gathering this, because we've stated it a number of different ways, but I figure we should be explicit here, and that's pacing, fast-paced thing. Like if you say something's fast-paced or intense, as you've said a number of times, that doesn't mean that it's an action scene.
No, not at all.
For example, in Justified, you know, what I think one of mine and yours mutual favorite scenes, it's not an action scene. In fact, it's almost kind of, it's like, it's really slow. He walks into Win Duffy's, his RV,
Yeah.
you know, racks his gun, pulls out a bullet, tosses it at him and says, the next one's coming faster.
Yeah.
Right. You know, one of the best one-liners ever.
Absolutely amazing.
But that's not an action scene, but the intensity is there because of the emotion that's given, because of the buildup that's happened, because of the context around the situation.
Well, and because you know every character involved and you care about every character involved. This goes back to character. We talked about this before. You can make the scene the most intense thing in the universe, but if the reader doesn't care about the characters, doesn't matter at all.
It doesn't matter.
You can blow up whole planets and it doesn't matter. Who cares? Well, like
Star Wars.
yeah, Star Wars. I mean, they blew up whole planets like this last one. They just nuked entire planets, but we didn't even know the planet's name. So who cares? It's just a thing. They're meaningless to us.
Whereas in the first the first real Star Wars movie, A New Hope, after Alderaan is blown up, you see it from the point of view of Leia.
Yeah,
Right.
that's her
planet,
home.
That's her home, and you see her just crumble. Right. That's the whole difference of that.
It matters.
It matters.
You know, it's fact about the intensity. What you were saying just now about it doesn't necessarily need to be an action scene. I think one of the greatest, most intense scenes on film ever is the Call It Friendo scene from No Country for Old Men with
Oh.
Javier Bardem.
That's right. Yeah.
You guys, okay, so if you guys have not seen this, it's a very, and it's interesting because this is a slow-paced movie.
It is.
It's a very slow movie, except there's this scene where Javier Bardem is playing like the sociopathic killer, and it's just him having a conversation with the gas station owner, and it's just nothing really happens in this except they talk about its coin costs. Yet if you go pull it up on YouTube,
Right.
just put in No Country for Old Men, Call It Friendo or coin flip scene, watch that scene. And that is one of the most intense things ever. And so that's a great example. Is like, it doesn't need to be an action scene to be emotionally intense.
Well, and to go along with that, I think, you know, we've been very open in the past that one of the characters in our novel, Servants of War, the character Christoph, that he's based on Christoph
Oh,
Waltz.
absolutely, yeah. He's totally Christoph Waltz.
It's Christoph Waltz from Inglourious Basterds. That character specifically,
Yep, absolutely.
and more specifically, that opening scene of that movie,
Well, yep.
which again, until the last 20 seconds of that scene, and it's a long scene.
Hmm.
It's I don't know how long it is. I want to say it's like 15 or 20 minutes, but maybe it's not. Anyway, that whole scene is just it's two people sitting there talking.
Yeah, in English and French.
I think it's 2 or 3 different languages.
Yeah, and he's just drinking milk.
And but it is intense.
Yeah.
That whole scene from start to finish is intense.
Yeah, because it's one of those things is once you have the context, it matters more. So as a writer, you got to establish the context of why this stuff matters, and then you turn that dial up and down. It's kind of like when you listen to music, the entire song is not the crescendo of the song. Okay, if you're listening to music and the entire song is just the big crescendo banging of drums, you're going to get bored of that.
Yeah, you're listening to Dragon Force.
That's because there are some examples of things that are purposely like cranked to 11. Now you can do that, but you notice even the stuff that tends to be that, they still will vary it up enough to make it good. Once again, people are going to argue about that because it's all subjective.
Sure.
But you gotta have that knob. You've got to have the ups and the downs. You've got to have the times where you break away. Somebody asked me a long time ago, it's like, why? It's like I read your books, and I'm even interested when people are just sitting around eating breakfast.
Good.
And I was like, the thing is, though, I never write a scene where it's just about people eating breakfast. That's not what the scene's actually about. The scene's actually there for some reason. Mm-hmm. Never put in a scene that doesn't serve a purpose.
Well, yeah, because one, if it doesn't serve a purpose, all you're doing, one, is you're crushing your pacing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we talk about fantasy, but like when you get into the epic fantasy, this tends to be the genre of the giant, fat, huge books and it's like 17 book series of 400,000 word novels. Those tend to be the ones that tend to be the flabbiest, languid pacing, because it's like, oh, great, 36 pages talking about the trees. Oh, 15 pages about people, like how they like to eat rabbit. It's just like, come on, dude. One of the best compliments I ever got for Son of the Black Sword is my epic fantasies are paced like a thriller. And I took that and I was like, thank you. Because I love fantasy, but I also hate that bloated, slow. And you get some of these series where what happens is not just one book, where they'll have so many pointless diversions that are slowing the pacing down that they'll have a whole book in the series where literally nothing happens because they're just catching up with the 17 subplots and 200 secondary characters. So you'll have whole, like book 8, 9, and 10 in a series are just nothing happened. And you hear this all the time for epic fantasy series.
Oh, for sure. And I think that was one of the things that I was very conscious of when we were writing Servants of War. And to go along with that, we've said it numerous times in previous episodes that when it comes to characters and point of view, that you're telling the story from the most interesting point of view, for that scene from the most interesting point of view. And they should only notice the things that are relevant to them, really. I think what we end up seeing a lot in epic fantasy is everybody notices everything. The one thing, the analogy I always give is somehow in epic fantasy, everybody always notices the architecture of everything that's around them. And I'm like, you know what? No one cares.
I don't notice architecture.
I don't.
If I was writing a scene from my perspective, I would never note, like, that looks cool or it looks stupid. That's like my entire knowledge of architecture. Right. If I was writing the scene from my wife's perspective, she would actually know what all that stuff is called.
Right.
And there's always another one too, notice in fantasy that like, there's always these dudes that like know about dresses.
Yeah, that's
like you get a male point of view character who can talk about like a woman's dress. In real life, you know what men notice about dresses? If the chick is hot or not.
I was going to say, does she look good or not?
Does she look good or not? That's our knowledge.
Or it's like, is the color bright?
I can tell you what color it is.
Drab?
It's blue.
So my point here is that you can help yourself with pacing a lot by focusing on what's important with character. When it comes to writing stories, nothing really ever happens in a vacuum. Everything is interrelated. Everything touches other pieces of the story. And character, I think, is very important for this because characters, one, are the ones who end up relaying information to the reader. So the method in which they do so can affect pacing. If they're long-winded and boring about what they're talking about, guess what? Your scene is going to be long-winded and boring, and therefore your pacing is going to suck. If everyone is always constantly seeing and noticing the same things and talking about the same things, then it all becomes the same. Once again, your pacing suffers.
Well, and everybody has a different sense of humor.
Exactly.
Which also, that's one thing
That's
too.
the Joss Whedon syndrome.
Yeah. Now here's a secret weapon. If you're writing a third person book where you can jump around from character to character, don't be afraid to have every now and then go back to the funniest character. So like you can have a dark and intense book, but let's go to the funny guy and let him make some jokes.
Yeah.
And break it up a little bit. Or whoever has the most absurd view of the situation. Or so Monster Hunter's in first person usually, and so what'll happen is in those, as far as breaking up the pacing, I'll have like super intense, scary monster fight, but then we'll go visit the gnomes,
Right.
Because they're goofy and silly and funny, or some other creature that's weird and goofy and funny and silly, and that's once again breaking up the pacing because in that it's not an intensity thing, it's more of a directional thing. So if we're going to take a one chapter diversion where stuff gets a little funny. And then it's going to go get dark and crazy again,
Yeah, and I think that those offsets in tone and in character, first of all, it keeps things fresh. It goes back to one of the earlier comments you made about how when you're writing, I know since you don't label the chapters, that's so that you can kind of reorder things here and there a little bit later, so that not everything feels like it's same-o.
Well, because what happens too is when you're writing the rough draft, there's a trap to fall into where you get in the zone of writing one character. And so you'll go ahead and you'll bang out like 3 scenes from that one character's perspective. But then what happens is when then you get into the actual book, you got 3 scenes in a row from the same character. And it's leaving the other stuff to the side. It's not getting any attention for a while. And so what happens is that screws up your pace there. So what I'll do is I'll take those 3 scenes and I'll break 1.5 one direction, 1.5 the other direction, and stick somebody else in the middle.
Sure.
Another trap to avoid falling into, and I actually got this from Brandon Sanderson a long time ago when he wrote Elantris. He had 3 characters, right? And so you had 3 point of view characters, but chapter 1 was one character, chapter 2 was character 2, chapter 3. Then it was back to 1, 2, 3.
Cycle.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
1, 2. It was a cycle. And what he said, and it stuck with me over the years, and I've never done this because he said this, and it stuck with me. And I didn't like it. I didn't like how that worked because he said what happens is inevitably when you have a bunch of characters like that, somebody has a favorite character, right? You have a character that you love, and you have a character that you don't like. So what happens if it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3? Guess what? Character number 3 is the guy you don't like. The reader is going to start to dread chapter 3.
Yep.
Chapter 6, chapter 9, chapter 12. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so once again, as far as pacing goes, don't fall into a predictable rut.
Well, and likewise, and this is one of the tricks that I do while I'm writing. And I'll go through this real quick before we wrap up. And don't worry, we're going to come back to pacing again. This is a huge topic, which is why we left it by itself. And we will definitely come back and hit this again. But one of the things that I'll often do is I'm also very conscious of, I don't know, maybe this is a little OCD. I'm very conscious of paragraph size.
Mhm.
And so if I see more than 2 paragraphs in a row that are the same size, I start breaking them up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll either squish 2 together or I'll split one of them in half.
That's like actually kind of a fractal version of what we've been talking about.
Exactly.
That's you've taken this back a level to like the cellular building blocks.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been talking about scenes and chapters, but what Steve just said there about paragraphs is spot on.
Yeah.
So if you have a dialogue section where it's like short, pithy, short, that's great, but you can only do that for so long. Then you need to drop in another descriptive paragraph or an action paragraph.
Mm-hmm. Or a lot of times what I'll do is, and I'll do this intentionally, and I think that you and I talked about this, you commented on this a while back. I'll get into a mode where I'll write things a certain way. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll I'll start with like a longer paragraph, and then each subsequent paragraph gets a little shorter and shorter and shorter until I end with a one-liner.
Yep.
And I remember you and I were talking about this. I do that a lot, and sometimes it's not good, sometimes it is good. What I like about it is, again, it's that slope. All of a sudden, you start building momentum into something, and then so you have to make sure that at the end of that, you're hitting something hard, whatever that is. Whatever that last line is, needs to be important.
Yeah, and you do that a lot. And the thing is, one of those, what I did like on the final pass is I just made sure we didn't have that too much, too often.
Exactly.
You know what trick, and I got this from Dean Koontz a long, long time ago, and I noticed he does this a lot. It's actually kind of brilliant for pacing. If he has a scene where something is about to build up, and he's trying to build up intensity to a sequence, he will do some form of countdown.
Oh, yeah.
And what I mean is, like, it's the trick was, like, the trick he used example was, like, the character gets in an elevator and the fight is going to be on the 10th floor. Floor number 1, he's like checking his gun. Floor number 2, he's, make sure all this stuff. Floor number 3, floor number 4, he's thinking about how this guy murdered his wife, and now floor number 5, he's contemplating his revenge.
And then all of a sudden he doesn't realize what happened to floor 6 and 7 because he's on floor 8 now.
Yep.
And, you're effing with the pace.
And now he's having doubts.
Uh-huh.
But too late. It's floor 10. Ding.
Yep.
And so that's just an example of master of pacing. This same guy though wrote a book literally called Intensity, with the idea that he wanted to do a book that was pacing of nonstop intensity. Now I haven't read it, but I'm assuming he probably pulled it off because he's written like 200 novels. What's one thing too, guys? The more you do this, the more practice you get, the more tricks you're going to have up your sleeve that you can do all sorts of stuff. Just don't do the James Patterson. I have 600 chapters in my 600-page book.
No, that just gets annoying. All right, guys. Well, that's all we have for you for now for this topic of pacing. So, again, look, we'll come back to this. And for all you supporters out there, if you have questions regarding things that we talk about in this, gosh, Larry and I hit 8 million things within this episode. If you want more specific answers, man, that's why you can be a supporter. You can, when it comes to supporters, that is one of the main benefits of being a supporter is we will always answer your questions. And so if you want clarifying questions or you want us to hit something a little harder, let us know. We'll do it. Well, that's all we got for you today. This is the Writer Dojo. Take it easy.
Writer Dojo is Steve Diamond and Larry Correia. Produced by Jack Wilder and Bear and Hare Studios. Theme song, Word Mercenaries by Craig Nivo. New episodes come out every Wednesday wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/WriterDojo, by leaving a 5-star rating and review, and by helping to spread the word. To advertise on the Writer Dojo, email ads@writerdojo.com. All questions and comments can be emailed to questions@writerdojo.com.
It's the beauty of deadlines.